God, it is easy to think of myself as a vine, with others branching off me. How wrong! Jesus is the vine, and I am the branch on him. Do what needs to be done, Father, to make this vine-branch connection vigorous and healthy. Amen. In my first house, I had a neighbour who kept a lovely garden and was so appalled at my gardening skills, they offered to help. When I was away from home at work, they would trim my roses. A rose bush, if left to itself, will become straggly and tangled, as many of you know. It will produce odd-looking roses rather than good-looking ones. Pruning helps the roses to grow in the right direction, as you cut the branches that are growing inwards, so they are encouraged to grow towards the light. In this way, you might say, a rosebush becomes its true self. And it's the same with a vine, which needs to focus its energy on producing good grapes and not second-rate ones. Similarly, they produce a lot of superfluous growth that has to be cut back. So a vine produces what it's meant to. The word prune in English is different from that described in our reading that we have here in John's Gospel in verse 2. It's very much like the word clean or pure found in verse 3. Jesus deliberately links the pruning of the vine to the clean state of the disciples. They have already been cleaned as Jesus has spoken his word to them, calling them to take up their cross and to follow him. They have had to submit to the pruner's knife, cutting their goals and ambitions, and they have already borne fruit. But they must expect more pruning if they are to bear more fruit. Let's hold on to that thought, which we'll pick up in a minute. For within Jewish tradition, the vine is a picture of Israel. God brought a vine out of Egypt and planted it in the promised land. But this vine has been ravaged by wild beasts and needs to be re-established. Now, grapevine is a prolific plant, and a single vine bears many grapes. It's no wonder then that in the Old Testament, grapes symbolize Israel's fruitfulness, which we must remember is God's work as the vine dresser and not theirs. While in the Passover feast, wine symbolizes God's goodness to his people. So the original plan was that the vine that God planted would not exist for itself, but give fruit to the gardener. But Israel missed her calling, and Jesus is saying that he is now the true vine. That is the true Israel, the one on whom God's purpose now rests. In this, he is answering their earlier question in chapters 13 and 14, part of what we know as the farewell discourse, dominated by Jesus' imminent separation from the disciples and the need to reassure them that his departure will not leave them desolate. Rather, he is the means by which God's ancient promise to Israel will be fulfilled, the promise to dwell with them forever. So we read in verse 1, I am the vine, and my Father is the gardener. God is the gardener who cares for the branches, making them fruitful. The branches are those who follow Christ, true believers who produce fruit through their living union with Christ. This is in contrast with those who don't. They'll be separated from the vine and are as good as dead, so they'll be cut off and tossed to one side. In verse 2, we see two kinds of pruning, cutting back the fruitful branches for their growth. As I described earlier, God's discipline strengthens our character and our faith, and cutting off the branches that don't bear fruit. They're worthless, use up vital energy and sap, and risk infecting other branches. So we notice here the imperative to bear fruit. God's gracious invitation to dwell with his people is not an invitation to settle down and forget about the rest of the world, but it's a summons to mission. There's a conflict to be waged with the powers of this world and a tribulation to be endured. Jesus has called and chosen his disciples not for themselves, but to go and bear fruit in verse 16. Fruit which will last. Just as God traveled by cloud and by fire among the Old Testament people of Israel, so now Jesus leads his disciples and brings them along with him. They dwell with him as they go forth with him. As the late bishop and theologian Leslie Newbigin says, this shared life, this mutual indwelling of Jesus and his disciples is not an end in itself. It results in the bearing of fruit. That fruit, Newbigin insists, is love and obedience, which we read in verses 9 and 10. Fruit of the vine himself, not they themselves, a sign that the disciples belong to him. In this way, the life of Jesus is made visible to the world, and that fruit is evident, and that fruit given is evident and visible that a branch is part of the vine. But the production of fruit is not the direct responsibility of the branches. The gardener is ultimately responsible. So certain branches that belong to the vine but bear no fruit will be cut off. Branches that do bear fruit will be pruned that they may be more fruitful. A fruitless branch is not worth its place in the vine and is removed. Earlier in this gospel, Judas has left Jesus and the disciples and gone into the night. A weak branch is pruned to make it stronger. Peter fails, but is restored to bear fruit after the receiving of the Spirit at Pentecost. So one of the disciples' companions has already gone into darkness, but the gardener does not wield his pruning knife in vain. Even Jesus learned obedience through what he suffered, we read in Hebrews 5. The disciples can be relieved of the anxiety of fruit bearing, as they have only one task: to abide in the vine. We read in verse 3, "You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you." The disciples have been cleansed by the word. The whole revelation of God in Jesus, mediated through the cross, has cleansing power. But it is still necessary to abide in Jesus, a continually renewed act of the will. Jesus is the vine, the true Israel, the one on whom God's purpose now rests. His followers are members of God's people if they belong to him and remain in him. Jesus is expounding what being in him as he is in the Father really means. Firstly, Jesus is Israel in person and his followers members of God's people because they belong to him. Secondly, they are to enjoy an intimate relationship with Jesus and to prioritize and, as it were, cultivate that relationship. We might put that theologically. We have been justified with Christ, but we are to continue our sanctification with him. We have died with Christ, but must constantly put to death the old self with its selfish ambitions and ideas. And so we read in verse 4, "Remain in me, and I will remain in you." If a branch decides to go it alone and try to live without the vine's life, they'll soon discover their mistake. They'll wither and die and be good for nothing except the fire, in verse 6. By contrast, branches that remain in the vine and submit to the pruner's life live and bear fruit. This is what Jesus holds out to all his followers, including us. So we come to the paradox of abiding, something that's done by God once for all, but something that equally must be reaffirmed on our part. Abiding means holding on loyally to a decision once taken, which means we continually renew our trust. Jesus holds us. No one can snatch them out of my hand, he says in John 10. So we abide with him. This mutual indwelling is characteristic of the true Christian. Just as Jesus could do nothing apart from the Father, so we can do nothing apart from Jesus. We may do some good works, but the fruit is actually the life of Jesus, reproduced in the life of the world through our abiding in him. And in verses 7 and 8, Jesus spells out 4 things that follow from our abiding or remaining in him. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be given you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. Firstly, answered prayer. Secondly, glory to the Father. Thirdly, abundant fruit. And fourthly, recognition as disciples of Jesus. As Leslie Newbegin points out, these 4 things are linked. As the words of Jesus shape the prayers we offer, the answers to prayer take the form of fruit, and God, the gardener, is glorified. As this fruit is genuine fruit, people will recognize branches as true branches of the true vine. So how do we remain or abide with Jesus? Firstly, we must remain in the community that knows and loves Jesus and celebrates him as Lord. That is church. There is, in fact, no such thing as a go-it-alone Christian. You will, of course, remember the story of the man who went to see his priest to say that he thought he could do Christianity without church. All he had to have was his Bible and maybe a small book of prayers. There was a coal fire burning in the room where the 2 of them met. The priest said nothing, but in a pointed reply, took the tongs and removed a coal from the fire and let it rest on the hearthstone. The coal quickly cooled to become inert and without heat, an illustration of the Christian who chooses not to experience the fellowship of believers. Secondly, we must also remain a people of prayer and worship in our private lives. Just as people tuned into the news every day during World War II, listening intently to the wireless to hear of the war's progress or of a special message from the then Prime Minister, so we ensure that we are in touch, in tune with Jesus, knowing him and being known by him. These extraordinary promises about prayer are accompanied by the sharpest warnings in verse 6. After all, who wants to be lopped off and thrown into the fire? So we avoid being the Lone Ranger Christian, taking a posture that rejects the modern secular notion of a lone, confident Marlborough man riding his horse through the prairie. We also avoid those 2 extremes. One of the hyperactive Christian who's always rushing about, trying to get things done with lots of activity, but not really present to God, others, or themselves. These are perhaps the sorts of works that risk going into the fire after they have been tested and found wanting. The other extreme, of course, is the couch potato Christian, utterly content in a cotton wool world, even Barbie's world, if you've seen the film. Comfortably pious, saccharine and sanctimonious, too heavenly minded to be of any earthly use. Saccharin, as you probably know, is a non-nutritive artificial sweetener. No calories, no carbs, but no fruit. And although it always hurts, we must be ready for the Father's pruning knife. God is glorified, and we will be, by bearing good quality fruit. For that to happen, extra superfluous growth will need to be cut away. This will be an intimate process, and most people around us probably won't know about it. As Bishop Tom Wright says, the vine dresser is never closer to the vine, taking more thought over its long-term health and productivity than when he has the knife in his hand. As we read later in verses 9 and 10 of this chapter in John's Gospel, this glorifying of God is through love and obedience. Jesus is the mediator of God's love to us and our obedience to him, that we might abide in Jesus and Jesus in the Father. So the follower abides in the love of Jesus by following him along the same road that his disciples did, that moment-by-moment obedience disclosed by the daily routines where God has placed us. As Newbegin puts it, through Jesus we know and abide in the love of the Father. Through Jesus we learn and offer the obedience that we owe to the Father. He shows us God's love and shows us how to be obedient, mediating in a double sense the abiding love of God. Amen.